We've been discussing the theme of courage, and I just wanted to add to that a little bit more. And our definition of courage is the quality of mind that enables a person to face danger with self-possession, confidence, and resolution. And when we're thinking of danger, we're thinking not just of physical danger, but psychological danger, personal danger, reputational danger, anything that might put us at odds with others because of a stand that we take. We're going to look at examples of courage from the Epic of Gilgamesh, from ancient Mesopotamia, and an example from ancient Hebrew literature, the book of Daniel. And one of the kinds of courage that I want to talk about, when we think about courage, courage can be shown in different ways. And one of the ways courage can come at us is in the form of what I call dazzling courage. And for this, we'll turn to a portion of the Epic of Gilgamesh and using this particular translation here. And by dazzling courage, I mean, something that someone does that has that wow factor, like, wow, that was amazing what that person just did. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, part of the story is that Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu, they go to the cedar forest to slay Humbaba, who is kind of the embodiment of evil, right? And to slay Humbaba is to do a great thing. Now, it's complicated. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a pretty complicated text, and the way I'm presenting it here is a little simplistic. But from Gilgamesh's point of view, this is a good thing to do, to slay this terrible creature, Humbaba, and in the process of doing that, Gilgamesh will make himself famous, right? Gilgamesh will ensure that he is remembered through time. You might remember an earlier discussion where we talked about different paths to greatness, and we compared Sargon the Great, ancient Mesopotamia, and Moses, ancient Israel. And Sargon, his path to greatness was by doing great, notable things. I did this awesome thing, I did this awesome thing, and this is what Gilgamesh wants to do. He wants to do awesome things and be remembered for that. And one of the awesome things he can do is to slay Humbaba in the cedar forest. So Gilgamesh and Enkidu, we have Gilgamesh on the left there, Enkidu in the middle, Humbaba on the right. Gilgamesh and Enkidu reach the edge of the cedar forest. They can hear Humbaba, it's terrifying, and Gilgamesh is trembling, right? So courage involves facing some kind of fear, right? There's something fearful there. It's hard to imagine what courage could be if there's not something fearful in front of us, and so Gilgamesh feels that. His friend Enkidu is seized with terror. He says to Gilgamesh, I can't continue, I'm frightened, I'm going to go back to Uruk, and all men will know what a coward I've been, right? So Enkidu knows if I don't carry on, then that makes me a coward, okay? And Enkidu indicates that he's willing, he's so terrified by the prospect of taking on Humbaba that he's willing to accept that designation of coward. But Gilgamesh says, courage, dear brother, there's that word. This is no time to give in to fear. We've come so far, and our journey is about to reach its goal. So interesting thing here, and just one thing to think about, is that acts of courage usually don't come from nowhere. If a person acts courageously, and we ask, well, where did the person get the personal moral resources to act courageously in this particular moment? If we review that person's life, we'll probably see that this person has been practicing in a way. There's, courage, we can think of it as sort of an act of courage is a destination of a journey that a person's been on. There's some kind of practice involved. There's a life journey involved. Enkidu and Gilgamesh have been on this journey. They've arrived at the cedar forest, and Gilgamesh says, okay, we haven't come this far now to turn back. Gilgamesh says to Enkidu, dear friend, I cannot kill Humbaba alone. Stay with me, stand at my side. I think this is an important thing to notice, that people who act courageously, often they will take a solitary stand. When the moment comes, they will be on their own. But if we review their lives, often we'll see people who have encouraged them, people who have supported them, right? So there's this idea that although the courageous person may have to stand alone in that moment, it's likely that there are others who have helped that person, who have encouraged that person, who have helped that person to become a person of courage. And so Gilgamesh is telling Enkidu, I can't do this by myself. I need you to stand with me. Humbaba, meanwhile, is letting loose his own threats, and he says, I'm going to cut off your heads and I'm going to feed your guts to the vultures and the crows. So this seems like a fearful situation. Now Enkidu becomes the encourager. Remember, Enkidu was the one who was saying, look, I'm willing to be a coward. I want to go back to Uruk. I've had enough. Gilgamesh says, no, stay with me. Now Enkidu becomes the encourager, and he says to Gilgamesh, be courageous. There's that word again. Remember how strong you are. I'll stand with you. Now help comes from another source. Shamash, the god, sends a bunch of winds, different kinds of winds, and different versions of Gilgamesh you read, it'll give you a list of, the icy wind and the hot wind and the different kinds of winds that come. So Gilgamesh, although he gets the credit for slaying Humbaba, he's getting help from other sources. So Humbaba, recognizing kind of what he's up against now that Gilgamesh is here, and Gilgamesh has Enkidu with him, and Gilgamesh has Shamash on his side, now Humbaba seems to make a play here because he tells Gilgamesh now to have mercy on me. So Humbaba is no longer saying, I'm going to feed your guts to the vultures. Now he's saying to Gilgamesh, have mercy on me. Let me live in the cedar forest. If you spare my life, I'll be your slave. And I think what we might see here is temptation. Often folks who act courageously, in a way, I think a lot of times it's easy because they know what they should do. There's something they know they should do. There's a certain principle they know they should stand on. In that respect, often acts of courage are easy, but the actual doing of the courageous thing is not easy. And there will be temptations. Is there a way out? Is there some compromise, right? And compromise isn't always a bad thing, right? Sometimes we need to compromise. But sometimes stands need to be made. Sometimes acts need to be done, right? From Gilgamesh's point of view, Humbaba needs to be taken out. But here comes this temptation. And who knows how long Gilgamesh spends thinking about it. Well, okay, maybe I don't have to kill Humbaba. Humbaba can be my slave. That sounds sort of nice, But this moment of temptation comes. Enkidu jumps in again and says, Gilgamesh, you've got to establish your fame. You've got to be like Sargon, if you want to be remembered, you got to do great things. So that forever men will speak of brave Gilgamesh who killed Humbaba in the cedar forest. So Enkidu is playing this very important role of being the encourager now. And so we go to a different version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which reports that, Humbaba is killed, and the splendors of Humbaba are extinguished, and Gilgamesh gets this credit. O Gilgamesh, king and conqueror, glory to him. And so we see acts of dazzling courage, sort of that wow kind of courage. And this is an example in the Epic of Gilgamesh where perhaps we see something like that. So what I wanted to do is just show you a brief video clip of something like this wow kind of dazzling courage. And in this case, the clip comes to us from the series Band of Brothers, and it focuses on Lieutenant Spears. Now, as we see in the Band of Brothers, Lieutenant Spears is, somewhat of a complicated character, and so we don't want to raise him up as a character who, is not in any way complicated. All we're doing right now is focusing on this particular moment, and what we see in this scene is that there's an officer who's supposed to be leading this attack, but this officer has frozen. This officer is not responding. This officer is not being competent, right? And so the officers who are watching what's going on then, they call in Lieutenant Spears, right? And so Lieutenant Spears then has to go in and take over. And we see Lieutenant Spears, instantly doing that. He is immediately in charge and he leads the attack. This is a kind of dazzling courage. So let's watch this short scene from Band of Brothers.
Sir, we are sitting ducks here. We have to keep moving! We've got to keep moving! Captain Wires! You do not go after! Tell the battalion commander now, get back here!
Dick, I understand you're attaching to Easy Company, but
Spears, get yourself over here! Get out there and relieve Dyke and take that attack on in!
One fall blanket, two exposed!
Come on! Hang on, Virgo! Fire! I'm taking over. Precision, listen! Hang on! We got it. Sir, most of the company is spread out here. First platoon tried an end around, but they're stretched out. They're pinned down by a sniper. I believe he's in the building with the caved-in roof.
All right, I want mortars and grenade launchers on that building till it's gone. When it's gone, I want first to go straight in. Forget going around. Everybody else follow me?
Yes, sir.
Thank God.
All right, you heard the word. Second platoon on the CO! Sergeant Alley! Got it, Sarge!
Okay, so in Gilgamesh, in Band of Brothers, we've seen a couple examples of what we're calling here dazzling courage, sort of that wow kind of courage. Let's come to a different kind of courage, and this is what I'm calling quiet courage. And we're going to look at an example from ancient Hebrew literature from the book of Daniel. But before doing that, I wanted to show some clips from a different movie that I think gives us an example of quiet courage. And the background here is that you have an athlete, a runner named Eric Liddell. And Eric Liddell was very committed to the idea that Sunday, what he called the Sabbath, should be reserved for worship. It should be reserved for church attendance and doing things related to the worship of God. And for Eric Liddell, you should not work on Sunday, you should not engage in sports on Sunday. So he's going to run in the Olympics. And his race is the 100-meter race. This is the race that he's set to run. But he finds out that a heat for the 100 meters is on Sunday. And he has to decide what is he going to do, because he has this principle that you should not run on Sunday. Sunday is reserved for worship. But the heat, I've got to get through this heat in order to get to the final race. And so Liddell has to decide what to do. And what we're going to see in these clips is, first of all, Liddell is mulling it over, right? So I think on the one hand, this decision for Eric Liddell is easy. He knows what his principle is, and he knows that he won't run on Sunday. At the same time, it's not easy, because so far as he knows, if he refuses to run this heat on a Sunday, then he's not going to be able to run in the Olympics. And this is what, this is what he's been working for years. And so we're going to see him have different interactions with different people as he's discussing this principle that he's standing on.
When did you get to know?
Did you not read the papers this morning? I had the whole program. The heats for the 100 are on the Sunday after the opening ceremony, the semis and final a couple of days after. It's only a heat. Does it make all that difference?
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
Of sprinting and starting and medals and pace, yet so full of running you've no room for standing still.
Jenny, don't fret yourself.
I do fret myself, Eric. I'm frightened for you. I'm frightened what it all might do to you.
Do you know what day it is?
Yeah, Sunday.
Sabbath's not a day for playing football, is it?
It's an awful step you're taking, Liddell. The whole of Britain will be watching you. I don't know that they'll understand. I'm not sure that I understand.
not sure that I do either, sir. For the last 3 years, I've devoted myself to my running, just to be on this ship. I gave up my rugby. My work has suffered. And I've deeply hurt someone I hold very dear. Because I told myself, if I win for God. And now I find myself sitting here, destroying it all. But I have to. To run would be against God's law. I was mistaken. God made countries. God makes kings and the rules by which they govern. And those rules say that the Sabbath is his. And I, for one, intend to keep it that way.
Mr. Liddell, you're a child of your race, as I am. We share a common heritage, a common bond, a common loyalty. There are times when we're asked to make sacrifices in the name of that loyalty. Without them, our allegiance is worthless. As I see it, for you, this is such a time.
Sir, God knows I love my country, but I can't make that sacrifice.
Now, in reality, things work out differently than we see in the film. And so the film doesn't give us the actual historical truth, but the film is truthy in that it tells us basically what the story is. But it is true that Eric Liddell refuses to run on Sunday. It's true that he comes under a lot of pressure to run. It's true that he takes a lot of criticism for refusing to run. People say, well, he's a fanatic, you know. Now, what we see in the film, we didn't see it in the clips we just watched, but what we see in the film is that Liddell is actually able to run the 400 race, which is on a different day. And so Liddell takes his stand, I'm not going to run the 100, but he is able to run the 400. And if you want, you know, the sort of the broad background to this really interesting story, the book There for the Glory is a biography of Eric Liddell that I would highly recommend. And what we see in Liddell's life from the beginning to the end, and he died quite young, in his early 40s, and he died in a prison camp. He became a missionary in China. And after the Japanese invade China, then Eric Liddell goes into a prison camp, and that's where he dies. But one of the things that we see throughout Liddell's life is that he was a person of courage, but not a person of dazzling courage. Eric Liddell did not set out to wow people with his incredible feats. When people would ask him about, you know, winning the 400 race, the 400 meter, 400 yards, I'm not sure which, but when people would ask him about winning a race in the Olympics, he would often downplay it. Right? And this was one of his characteristics. So Eric Liddell was not out to make a great name for himself. Right? He was out to achieve. He was competitive. He wanted to win, but not for the pursuit of glory. Eric Liddell felt that if he could achieve at a very high level on the track, then that would open up other opportunities for him to do what was most important to him, and that was to preach the Christian message and to be an effective missionary. One of the things we see is Eric Liddell is in this camp, and as he is getting sick and as he dies very young, we see this quiet courage continuing. And an illustration of this is the book down below called The Disciplines of the Christian Life, which he wrote in this prison camp. And I think one of the most interesting, for me, the most interesting thing about this book is how uninteresting it is. I mean, I read this book expecting to find reflections on what it's like to be a champion runner in the Olympics. I expected to read, you know, about the psychological turmoil of being in a prison camp in a time of war. There was none of that. If you read this book and didn't know anything about Eric Liddell, you would have no idea that he was an Olympic champion. You would have no idea that he was a prisoner in a prison camp during war. And that is remarkable because it gives us insight into this person's character, right? This was a person who was not interested in drawing attention to himself. This was a person who's interested in drawing attention to something else. And it's right there in the title of his book, The Christian Life, right? Pointing people to the way of God, pointing people to the teachings of Jesus. This is what was most important to him. We see something like this in the case of Daniel. And so here we turn to ancient Hebrew literature, to the book of Daniel. And one of the things we've mentioned in these discussions is that the ancient Hebrews, for all of their incredible influence in their own day, in their own world, were weak peoples, often conquered by others. And here, if you look at present-day Israel right there at the Eastern Mediterranean, we see that present-day Israel is under another empire. It's under the Persian Empire in this case. And this is the context of the book of Daniel. Now, just to make a couple basic points, as it says here, Daniel was a person of exceptional qualities. So he is a Hebrew serving within the Medo-Persian Empire. This is the context of the story. And he's a person of exceptional qualities, right? But there are others who also have administrative positions who are jealous of him. And so they want to find some way to take Daniel down. And they look for, possible acts of corruption that they can bring against Daniel. But they can't find any acts of corruption. They could find no corruption in Daniel. And so they say, we'll never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So it's a little bit like Eric Liddell, right? What is at the center of Liddell's life? His identity as a Christian, his commitment to God, his commitment to the law of God, his commitment to the teachings of Jesus, right? What do we have in Daniel? A person whose identity is centered in the worship of his God. And these guys say, if we're going to get Daniel, we've got to, go at him this way. We've got to find something to do with the law of his God. So as the story goes, what they do is they go to the king and they say, look, let's promulgate, let's put out a law that for 30 days, no one is allowed to pray to anything but you. And so they're clearly, making an appeal to the king's ego, right? They're stroking the king's ego. And they're saying, King, you're so awesome, people should pray to you. And let's make a rule that if anybody prays to anything but you for 30 days, then that person will go into the lion's den. The understanding that the lions will kill and probably eat this person. And the king says, well, that, his ego having been inflated that way, the king goes along with this, right? So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now here's a great line. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. This law makes no difference. Now, remember, Daniel was a person of high status within this kingdom, right? Highly respected. So clearly an observer of the laws. But here's one law that he can't abide by, because there's a higher law. You might remember the discussion we had about Antigone, right? Antigone recognizes that the king Creon has the power to promulgate, to put out laws, but there's a higher law. It's the law of Zeus. And Antigone has to decide, do I abide by the higher law of Zeus or do I obey Creon? She makes her decision. Daniel does the same. What's interesting is that we have no discussion of that. On the one, it seems fairly straightforward. Daniel says, oh, okay, well, yeah, basically I'm a law-abiding person. That's why I have this high position in the kingdom. But here's a law that I simply cannot go along with. And so we get the impression that he simply ignores it. All right? It's hard to believe that there's not some internal deliberation that Daniel undergoes, but we're not told about that. Daniel just simply ignores the law. And so Daniel clearly breaks the law. And so these guys who want to take Daniel down, they go to the king and say, Daniel has broken this law. According to the law, he has to go into the lion's den. Darius is, regretful that he passed the law, Daniel goes into the lion's den, but survives the night. But the thing and I encourage you to read the story of Daniel in the lion's den, in the book of Daniel, in the Hebrew scriptures, in what we call the Old Testament. So it's a great little story. But the thing to focus on here is this really kind of casual way that Daniel's courage is described. He had a principle. One principle is be law-abiding, right? This is how he had the rank that he had. But he also had another principle, that the law of God is the highest. And if any human law says that I can't pray to God, then that human law is secondary, and I will have to stand by the primary law, which calls on me to pray to God. And it took a kind of courage, of course, to take that stand, knowing that doing so would lead to him going into the lion's den. But notice that he doesn't give any speeches, he doesn't preach any sermons, he doesn't send out, email blasts, he doesn't write a letter to the editor of the newspaper to make his case. He simply carries on doing what he believes he should do. So we've had these examples of dazzling courage, Gilgamesh, of Lieutenant Spears. We've had these examples of quiet courage, Daniel, Eric Liddell. Previous discussions, we've talked about Antigone, just mentioned her a minute ago, the case of Esther, also from the Hebrew Scriptures. I think one of the things that we see in each of these cases is the ability of these folks to step outside the crowd. We're not saying being antisocial. We're not saying, intentionally being weird, right? So, we're not talking about drawing attention to yourself intentionally, right? Although Gilgamesh wants to do that in a way, right? And so I guess that gets a little complicated too. But in each of these cases, what we see is an ability to step out of the crowd. So in the case of Gilgamesh, I'll step out and be the one who takes on Humbaba. In the case of Lieutenant Spears, I'll be the one who steps out and takes leadership. Of course, he's ordered to do that, but the reason he specifically is ordered to do that is because he's able to do that. And he shows a kind of dazzling courage. Daniel, I'll be the one to step out, right? Everyone else in the kingdom is obeying this law. There's a higher law that I have to obey. Eric Liddell, I have a principle. I should not run on Sunday. All right, that's the Lord's day. Therefore, whatever the people of Britain think, I have my principle that I'm going to stand on. Antigone has her principle. Esther has her act of courage. And in each case, they're able to separate themselves from the crowd. Again, we're not talking about being antisocial, but we're talking about developing something within ourselves that allows us, that makes it possible for us when the moment comes to separate from the crowd, when we have to take a courageous stand. So let's finish up by looking at this quote from Aristotle. And we've looked at this before. And Aristotle says that look, any moral characteristic, any moral trait that we have comes about as a result of practice. Just as a good builder becomes a good builder by practicing, and a good piano player becomes a good piano player by practicing, so a person becomes truthful by practicing truth-telling. Right? A person becomes dependable by practicing being dependable, that is, doing things that make me dependable. I have the choice. Will I be dependable here or will I not be dependable? If I choose to be dependable, then I've strengthened that part of my character. If I choose not to be dependable, then I've strengthened that, right? And so Aristotle says that if we want to be people of courage, then the same thing is true. And so it is the way that we behave in our dealings with other people that makes us just or unjust. And the way that we behave in the face of danger, accustoming ourselves to be timid or confident, that makes us brave or cowardly. The little things that arise. And I think for young folks, often this has to do with following the crowd. Right? Following the crowd can be a good thing. If the building is on fire and the crowd is heading for the exit, obviously being with the crowd is the smart thing. Sometimes being with the crowd is the right thing. But courageous people, it seems to me, are folks who have the ability, when the moment comes, to separate from the crowd. The crowd is doing something that I know is wrong. I'll separate. The crowd is laughing at something that should not be laughed at. I separate. The crowd is is engaging in a conversation about something or going to some place, right? There's something going on here that breaches a principle that I have, and I need to separate. I don't want to be that kind of person. I don't want to be the kind of person who brings that kind of thing into my mind, that brings that kind of thing into my soul. And I don't really care if in the group of 30, if 29 of them are all going to go do that. I have a principle that I'm going to stand on. I'm going to be a person of courage, right? These kinds of decisions come up, and often they're very small, all right? But there's that, remember that temptation that Gilgamesh faced, right? There's that temptation just to go along because it's small. It's not a big deal. I'll just go along, right? What Aristotle's saying is no, if we're going to be people of courage, we have to practice. Because we can't be that person like Daniel. We can't be that person like Eric Liddell. We can't be that person like Antigone. We can't be that person like Esther if we don't practice in the small things. They had big decisions to make, crucial decisions to make, life-altering decisions to make, right? But to make those kind of decisions well, we have to practice. And these little instances come up. I'm going to work on being a person of courage. Again, not to intentionally be, antisocial. That's not the point. But to be a person of integrity, to be a person of honor, to be a person of courage, to do useful things, to have principles. The world needs these kinds of people. And I hope that all of us will work on being these kind of people.